Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome back. After a fantastic start to the morning, I get the privilege of kicking off and doing a bit of theory before we get into our next panel. So forgive me for not being anywhere near as interesting and sportsmanlike. My name's Adam Dent. I'm the Chief Executive of the New South Wales State Insurance Regulatory Authority, so a little bit north from here. It's my pleasure this morning to kick today off with our panel discussion on trust, why it matters and how to earn it. Joining me in the stage today, and I'll do the intros now, are Judge Gerard Phillips, the President of the Personal Injury Commission. Judge Phillips is the inaugural President of the PIC in New South Wales, the first tribunal in New South Wales to hear both workers' compensation and motor accident matters. Prior to his appointment to the District Court bench in 2019, Judge Phillips was a solicitor in private practice for over 30 years, specialising in employment and industrial law, and was a partner at global law firm K&L Gates and served on its Global Management Committee. While in practice, Judge Phillips was a frequent author in the AFR on a range of legal and industrial relations topics. He's currently a Counsel Fellow at St John's College within the University of Sydney. Good morning, Judge. With Judge Phillips is Camille Wilson. Camille is a leading expert, speaker and author in workplace mental health with over a decade of experience working in human resources and consulting teams, designing and delivering workplace mental health programs across diverse industries. Camille is passionate about driving real change in workplaces that are inclusive, safe and meaningful for employees. Camille's passion is derived from her own lived experience of a mental health condition in the workplace and shares her story as a speaker to make genuine change in how we address mental health at work. Good morning, Camille. And finally, Belinda Pratt, the COO of the Motor Accidents Insurance Board down here in Tasmania. She oversees claims, injury management and administration and corporate assurance and risk functions within the MAIB. Her role as COO, Belinda oversees the administration of medical and incomes benefits on a no-fault basis to people injured as a result of a motor accident while enabling access to common law. Belinda's team at the MAIB are committed to delivering client-centred outcomes, acting fairly, partnering with providers and making a valued contribution to the Tasmanian community. Belinda, good morning and welcome. So thanks to the panel for joining us. Just to start, we're going to set the scene a little in relation to trust, and we almost had Edelman join us but couldn't quite get them here. So I wanted to just quickly go over the most recent 2023 Edelman Trust Barometer that may be familiar to many of you. It takes a look at both the state of trust in both the public and private sector across Australia. So they do an international report. This is based on the Australian report. It uses a sample of about 1,150 respondents who are reflective of the general population, so it's statistically relevant, although there may be some actuaries in the room who'd have some different views on the degree of relevance of the sample. It measures trust in NGOs, business, government and media, so 4 domains there that we're looking at. And what really comes out this year is Australia is becoming a more polarised society and more so within the younger generations. For the second year in a row, Australia saw the biggest drops in trust anywhere in the world, with a decrease of 5 points from last year. We're now in the red distrusting territory. Importantly, no institution in Australia is trusted. Business and NGOs are considered neutral, and government and the media are in the distrusted territory. All 4 institutions dropped by at least 4 or more points since 2022, government seeing the biggest drop of 7 points. Gen Z and high-income workers drove the biggest downturn in trust, also noteworthy there, and the national decline has been felt across all industries. Healthcare and education continue to be the most trusted industries in Australia. Job losses continue to be the #1 fear in Australia, with most people thinking that them and their families won't be better off in 5 years' time. There's also been a drop in trust for traditional authority, so leaders such as CEOs and government leaders are in the red distrust territory. The most trusted source of info continues to be people's co-workers. The media and government are blamed for fueling the cycle of distrust, with these two seen as a source of false or misleading information. Meanwhile, business and NGOs are seen as more reliable sources of trustworthy information. Now, as I mentioned, we move on to sort of polarisation. Australia sits moderately polarised, with distrust in government and a lack of shared identity being the biggest factors for us to tackle. 61% of respondents said in Australia the lack of civility and mutual respect today is the worst they've ever seen. Now, business does remain in a unique sort of position despite how depressing some of those initial results are. It's the only institution in Australia seen as both competent and ethical. Business enjoys most of its trust from its employees, and there's certainly been, I think, since this report was written, there's probably been a few things happening in recent weeks that might potentially change that next year round, but nevertheless, it is seen as competent and ethical at large. People have shown they want more engagement from business on a variety of issues, particularly on issues such as economic inequality, energy shortages and climate change. In Australia, CEOs are most expected to act on the employees' climate and discrimination. People believe the best outcomes are achieved when government and business work together. And all in all, the real key takeaways here to improve, I guess, the polarisation we're seeing are that business and government need to work together as partners to empower young people to take care of people and unite for change. It's the overarching message from Edelman this year. So in real terms, a pretty depressing picture about the state of trust, and particularly when you have a good look at the report, the falling nature of it over time, where of course COVID actually did some good things in terms of overall trust at different points in time. What we're seeing now is this overall decline quite dramatically. Now, I wanted to reflect a little bit on what you can do to build trust and how it works from an institutional point of view. Trust isn't just formed by one's upbringing or their demographic alone, so their propensity to trust. Rather, there are drivers that are more likely to make us willing to trust. So this, the model I've got on the screen here is Mayer, Davis and Shorman's model of organisational trust. From memory, it was about 1995. Yep, 95. So it's been around a long time, and there have been numerous papers that have sort of developed around organisational institutional trust, but all of them seem to come back to fundamentally this Mayer, Davis and Shorman model. The professors are both from disciplines such as psychology, social studies and management, and this is their sort of what they consider a universal model. So there's no universal definition of the word trust. So essentially they've used for the purpose of their study the willingness of a party to be vulnerable to the actions of another party. Basically, trust is about my willingness to take risk. They think there are three things that people judge someone else's trustworthiness on. The first being ability or competence, depending on which paper you read. So basically, how intelligent or competent is that person or that organisation? So do they have the capacity to do the thing they say they're going to do? Benevolence, and that's the extent to which you believe you have the other person's interest at heart. And then integrity, how congruent the actions you do take are with the intentions and the words that you express. Those three things combined with a natural propensity to trust that somebody has will basically determine the degree of risk someone is prepared to take on you in that trust relationship. So, as an example, when a person or organisation is consistent in showing that their ability, benevolence and integrity can be trusted, trust will get stronger. Think about an organisation or individual is honest. If you don't think an organisation or an individual is honest, there's no hope. So that's the starting point. So your natural propensity is going to drive that. No amount of ability is going to persuade you to trust somebody if you fundamentally start from a position of not. If they can have great abilities, but if you don't think, so if you as the trustor don't think they have your best interests at heart, you're not going to trust them. And they'll actively distrust the organisation or individual. Similarly, if an individual or organisation manages to convince a customer that they have integrity, but doesn't convince them that they'll behave benevolently towards them, the customer's going to have a hard time trusting them as well. So those three things have to interplay altogether. You can basically be honest, but not do what they need, and they'll probably have a little more hope for you. So the final quote in the paper I think that was worth looking at is the professors Mayer, Davis and Shorman have said, working together often involves interdependence and people must therefore depend on others in various ways to accomplish their personal and organisational goals. Probably not the powerful line I wanted them to finish on, but nevertheless, when you consider those three factors put together, it helps us to understand where those things perhaps more likely would go wrong than perhaps what it is we might need to do from the start. So that's the theory out of the way. We know how trust is formed and the state of trust in Australia. I'm going to join the panel now to hear from some real experts rather than some academics about how it all really works. And we'll start with, from a macro perspective, what's the current state of trust in society in your view outside of just this Edelman work?
Well, I think it's pretty poor, and when I read the Edelman paper, it probably sat with some views that I had about how the world was. I was looking at it thinking from, say, the courts and tribunals point of view, and thought, well, we can't be immune from that, because if institutions are generally not trusted, and even though the courts aren't in that, I think that's a worry, because everything that we do really depends upon the consent of the community to accept the decisions that we come to. So I think it's a worry. And it is something I do speak about to our 220 decision makers, because if trust goes, institutions are pretty fragile. And so an institution like ours, if we lose, either the sort of plaintiff or the, insurance industry's trust that what we're doing is the right thing, it's all over. So it's a worrying thing, I must say, for me, sitting as president, that, this is what the community is seeing in its institutions.
The other reason that's probably really complicated is in a sort of more in a judicial environment or in a tribunal environment, you're dealing with people who don't have a choice but to be there. So they can't go somewhere else if they don't trust you to do it. So that, I think, adds probably an extra weight of responsibility, really, doesn't it? It
does, and I think a lot of people feel that they've lost control of their life when they're before a court or tribunal, because here's somebody. I mean, as a judge or a tribunal member, you are invested with a lot of power over someone's life. You really are, and so part of the skill is to actually engage with the plaintiff or the individuals there, even through the interference their lawyers might try and put there, but just to make them understand, yes, this is about you, this is your case, I'm here to hear from you, and if you don't understand anything, please ask your lawyer or whatever, but they've got to be made feel that they're part of it, because the case is about them. It's not just all about how clever their lawyer is, because look, at the end of the day, you do have to make some hard decisions and people sometimes lose, but what they need to feel that they've been listened to, process was fair, and that the decision you publish actually convinces them as to why the result is what the result is.
I think it's a good point around the willingness. You mentioned before that trust is about your willingness to kind of take risk, but people aren't in these schemes or insurance processes because they chose to be there. They are also, as you kind of touched on, I didn't expect to go so deep so quickly, but putting my psychology hat on, when we think about injury and disability that does happen in midlife or part of our lives that we weren't born with necessarily, and even if we are born with it, we do have some level of trauma that goes with that. And one of the biggest things around trauma when we talk about it is this idea that your preconceived ideas of the world is disrupted. So you live in a world, you have safety, and we live in worlds of safety, and that's what we create. We have these constructs in our minds of, I'm safe, I trust the world. So when we get injured or we have a disability that was unexpected, we then go, I can't trust the world anymore. And suddenly then you're put into a system, a process, a system, a scheme, and suddenly, not just because maybe the scheme isn't actually not trustworthy, it's actually the fact that you've already had your trust broken. And when I was looking at this and thinking about trust and the state of trust in society, and what a big question. So thank you, Adam, for the massive question to start with. But when we're born, we do kind of trust the world. We inherently trust the world. Everyone always says when you look at a child, you think, wouldn't it be nice to live in that bubble, that joyous bubble of everything just seems so wonderful. And as I think even Dylan said, when you're a young person, you kind of learn from people around you, and you learn from other people that things aren't to be trusted. You learn from the adults that to be skeptical sometimes. And so it's a really, I find it's a really interesting topic, and it is interesting to see as we look at the report, the Edelman report, that the generations that are coming through now have a lot less trust and it's decreasing. So it is interesting to see that, and I think we can explore as we go through this panel today what's causing that and what's contributing it, especially from a technology perspective. But yeah, there's some initial thoughts of the state of trust in society today.
Yeah, no, very interesting points, Camille. And as speaking on behalf of the funding bodies, some of the things that resonated from that Edelman report were definitely around the economic environment. And even watching this morning on Sunrise, it was one of the things that people were most pessimistic about. So from a funding body perspective, we're certainly at the MAIB on the front foot with paying reasonable costs, because we want our providers to work with us so that our clients have the best outcomes that they can. So we're continually doing environmental scans of the market in Tasmania to make sure that we are controlling costs, but also we want the providers adequately compensated and incentivised to work with our clients, right? So we certainly are continually monitoring the situation there. The second thing I would say, the lack of trust in government from the Edelman report. So to be clear, we're not Tasmanian government, but we are Tasmanian government owned. So effectively, we're owned by the Tasmanian community. So we have a responsibility not only to fund the benefits for our clients on their recovery journeys, also the access to the common law rights, But we also have a huge responsibility to manage the funds that have been invested from Tasmanian vehicle motor registrations since 1974, so over a long period of time. And our board actively manages those funds so that we can provide the benefits that the scheme allows, but we also actively invest back into the community, so towards road safety, making Tasmanian roads safer for drivers, other things like that that help to build trust within the community. So certainly, I think the Edelman report hit on a number of things that we're all seeing, and I think it's about the actions that we can take to re-establish the trust relationship.
Now, I think we've probably touched on this next question, but I think for sort of the power of hitting it directly, why is trust so vital in insurance and compensation schemes?
So from, again, our perspective here in Tassie, and Camille's already touched on this, our clients call us when they are at their absolutely most vulnerable moments. So nobody gets into their car and thinks, I'm going to have a car accident today, right? So from the outset, establishing a trust relationship with our clients is absolutely imperative to what the teams do. So we want our clients to have the best possible recovery journey that they can, knowing that they've been through a traumatic experience. So we absolutely work on building that relationship up front, and I'll talk more about that as we go on. Secondly, from a provider perspective, so we are a little state, our providers are absolutely key to ensuring that our clients have the best outcomes. So we build trust with them through our relationships, we actively work with them, we listen to them. They know if they call us with an issue, our teams will work to resolve the issue for them. Even down to things like we have a lot of sole providers in Tassie, so we take a very responsible approach in that we pay quickly, right? Because if you're a sole provider, cash is king. So whatever it is that we can do to help the providers help our clients, we absolutely step into. And thirdly, why trust is so vital is because we are owned by the Tasmanian community. I've already talked about some of the monies that we reinvest back into the community. And as a mother of 3 teenagers, scary I know, living in rural Tasmania, we have an injury prevention and management foundation funding source, so organisations can apply for funding, and it makes me so proud that we fund things such as first aid training for high schools for kids living in rural areas, because emergency services can take a long time to get there, right? So if the kids are trained and educated in how to apply basic first aid in those first moments, it's a great thing. It's a great thing for the community. Same as other programs such as road trauma support counselling. So we also fund a free counselling, it's confidential service for anybody injured in a motor vehicle accident in Tasmania. So little things like that actually aren't that little, right? So that to me is really how we establish trust and why it's so vital to us as an organisation.
I think also just a societal obligation to actually provide a service that is trustworthy. I think coming from a lived experience perspective, just touching on your point that people don't choose to be there, it's actually quite, no one plans to go car accident or equivalent of any kind of injury or disability. I remember being, this is now 7 years ago, but when I went through my most severe point of where I was unwell, the hardest thing to deal with was actually just coming to terms with the fact it happened. Or it happened to me, and I was going through this whirlwind of life, and that no one could truly understand just how unwell I was. And mine was a mental health condition, which is different to coming a physical injury, but it is, just reflecting back on what you said, it is you actually just don't have the conscious ability to engage into the things around you logically in some way. And even just reflecting on more recently, and I'm going pretty personal here, but even just a month ago, I was on holiday and had a physical health issue when I was overseas in Japan. Didn't expect it, happened on my first day of my holiday. It was my honeymoon, a very late honeymoon after COVID, but it was a honeymoon. And I remember contacting the insurance company about what was going on, and they sent me all these forms, and this form was legitimately like 10 pages, 20 pages long. And they're like, go fill this out and we'll talk to you later once you've filled it out. We'll let you know if it's a viable claim. And I'm sitting there in this foreign country, not speaking, no one speaks English. I was in a lot of pain. I was unsure what was going on. I have health anxiety, part of my anxiety condition. So my brain was just going 1,000 miles an hour. And then they emailed me every day going, have you filled out the form? Have you filled out the form? Have you filled out the form? And I think intent was that they wanted to help me. But the reality is that I was already sitting in a place where I wasn't in the safest of places. I was already surprised this had happened. And I guess there is that if they don't have the trust of the system, I was very much in a negative of wanting to fill out this form, wanting to engage them, and we have to be vulnerable. So just on that point, trust is about being willing to be vulnerable. And a lot of times we're not willing to be vulnerable, and that doesn't help the system. We want people to feel comfortable to be vulnerable and to share what's going on for them.
And by the sound of that story, I mean, trust is one thing, empathy would have been a little...
Empathy would have been useful there too, but that in itself, I'm sure we'll mention a few times, is empathy does feed into trust very quickly.
My word.
But that is a big change for the insurance industry, because the perception for a lot of claimants is that I put the claim in and these guys are looking to how they can knock it back. And so if that's the first encounter, by the time they get to us to resolve the dispute sometime down the track, it's kind of beyond redemption, and all you need to do is actually make the decision and get the poor person out of it, win, lose or draw.
Yeah.
But if it goes off the rails at that early point in terms of the interactions between a claimant and insurance company, it just means the entire start to finish of the system just has no trust, because they think it's the insurers more concerned about their bottom line. We've paid these premiums, and first time we put a claim in, this is the response we get.
I think it's such a valid point. If you're kind of assuming that you're going to be wrong done by, or that at the end of the day it's not for you. So I don't know how you change that though. Well,
I mean, and look, I'll be critical of my former colleagues in the legal profession. I really dislike the way they advertise for these things, because it actually sets up a conflict between, so the injured person and the insurance industry. That's the paradigm which they feed to their clients. And, if someone comes in to see you as a lawyer, they'll believe you because it might be the only, experience they've got. Occasionally have a look at the law firms who appear in front of us, like what their advertising is, and it's no good for the ultimate well-being of the client. It really is, and it looks like a game. We know what we're doing. You come with us, we'll get after this insurer, and wring every last cent out of them.
Yeah.
Which makes it really hard to resolve a matter.
Absolutely.
When you've set up that expectation just in a marketing sense.
Yeah.
Belinda, how do we measure trust to understand it within compensation schemes?
So the primary measure that we undertake is an annual client survey. So we survey, we have an independent research firm independently survey a statistically significant number of our clients, and we ask them questions in relation to 4 key elements. So how our claims officers performed, documentation, which you've already touched on, Camille. Documentation can be quite the challenge. Processes, as well as how our rehabilitation providers have performed. And from that survey, we then distill down key themes that we're seeing. So particularly in terms of trust, building the relationship with the claims officers is absolutely critical, because they're the people on the ground talking to the clients, talking them through their claim, their situation, their recovery journey. So we really do focus on, we ask 11 questions of how the claims officers have been interacting with the clients. And I'm really pleased to say that last year's survey we got 83.5%, so it's a really good score for a compensation scheme. So it tells us that our guys, they're doing a great job, there's no doubt about that. But it also does enable us, opportunities for improvement to look at where we've scored lower and what we can do, and I'll talk about some of those initiatives in a bit. But I think it's not just about the annual survey, right? It's about the continual feedback that we get. So in the modern day, the Google reviews, everybody loves a good Google review, even things like customer complaints, and we don't get many, but they're an opportunity to look at where trust might have broken down, okay? So there's certainly a number of different avenues I think that you can use to measure trust,
I think
they're the primary ones.
The move to real time that you're talking about is really important.
Absolutely.
A couple of years ago, I presented on the work we do around trust at CIRA across all of our schemes, and a couple of the measures we look at are really someone's perspective that they think their life will get back on track. So not just about the performance of the organisation, but how they feel in the system, and starting to really unpack and understand some of that. We did that work twice on an annual basis, but have seen the value in it, and now we're doing it essentially at milestones. So when somebody's been in one of our schemes for around 3 months, we'll reach out to them and ask them if they want to participate in the survey, and then as they exit the scheme. And we've had the first few batches of results coming through, so it's not yet enough data to be reliable, but we're starting to see that stuff and be able to, on a monthly basis, see what's the state of the scheme as much as the state of the relationships.
Yep.
I think the more we all do to understand that, the more hope we've got of building some of this sort of perception of both benevolence, but also the integrity piece, so we can actually respond while someone's still in scheme.
Absolutely.
Around some of the issues that they might be rising, which will help demonstrate that.
Just on that, Adam, though, with you, I think just coming back to Dylan's point before around data and what it actually tells us, and I think it's useful, and don't get me wrong, I think quantitative data and surveys are a very useful form of understanding things like trust, but also how do we expand that and actually get the voice of lived experience a bit more in detail? If anyone here's a researcher, qualitative research has a really great power when it comes to hearing voices and hearing stories. And I just wonder if sometimes we can use that and potentially deep dive onto points that come through on a quantitative survey and actually start to understand, listen and ask questions and deep dive a bit further through hearing the voice of lived experience. Just a thought.
Perfectly good suggestion. Now, this is almost a loaded question because the answer is possibly a little obvious, but on the whole, does trust increase or erode over time when someone makes a claim for compensation?
Well, by the time they get to us, I think the answer is pretty obvious by
Pretty
that
grim,
point.
isn't it?
Yeah. But when I look at it, though, out of all of the claims which are made, and you'd have the data, we see, probably 5% of them. And they're probably cases which were difficult, always going to get there. But I just think by that point, that it's really unfortunate. Because even if they win and win 100-0, the view that the claimant would have is that, well, why didn't they pay that straight away?
Yeah.
They were trying to, do me over. So, even a win is actually not a win, and it doesn't, do anything for that trust metric.
That's also an important perspective, I guess. We tend to have a habit of looking at things like client complaints. We tend to look at what the data's saying around disputes, which means we're almost in that analysis discounting, say, the 95% that appear to have otherwise gone okay. And I think there's probably a little lesson in there that it's so important to understand that, but to also sort of take a step back occasionally and stop that natural inclination to see the world only through the lens of the bad news you're seeing.
Yeah, and from our perspective, we believe it increases, and I'll give you a great example of a client story. So roughly speaking, broadly speaking, we have 3 types of claims. People that are in and out of the scheme pretty quickly, they have minor injuries, not with us for too long. Then we have more complex claims where people might be with us for weeks, months, maybe years. And then we have our lifetime care claims where people are seriously injured and they're going to be with us for life. And this particular client, Jared, so Jared has an acquired brain injury as a result of a motor vehicle accident he sustained back in '95. He was in a coma for a number of months and he had to relearn how to eat, how to walk, how to sit, all the things that he was doing as a young man at the time. So through his recovery journey, Jared underwent a whole ton of personal training and physio and exercise physiology to help him on his recovery journey. And he formed a great bond with his personal trainer, who then retired, and Jared got a new personal trainer. And Jared flagged that he had an interest in becoming a certified fitness professional. So not only were we able to assist Jared with his recovery and helping him with his independence, but we could also assist him with this dream of becoming a trainer. So really, really pleased to say that Jared achieved his dream. So through sheer perseverance, through working with all those providers who'd assisted him on his recovery journey, he is now he's got a Cert 3 in fitness, and he is able to take his love and passion for fitness and what he's achieved over his journey, and he can help other people with assistance, but he achieved that. So, that's, I think, a great example of how you can increase trust over the relationship with you, maintain that, and help people achieve their dreams, help them get to the best independence that they can.
I think I was going to say with trust, I think it's easy to lose and hard to gain. So even if we go into a system or a process with a lot of trust, it's very quick for you to go, actually, I don't trust this anymore. And that can be just from language that's being used, the way that empathy is being engaged with, trauma-informed care. There's so many different ways that people, and a lot of it comes back to human interaction. And I find it interesting, actually, the comments around the compensation, which, don't get me wrong, is really helpful when you're recovering. You know, I had about 20 million different appointments to get to, very costly. And my workplace at the time, I was working there about 6 months. I wasn't actually there that long. They said, you know what, Camille, I had quite a severe reaction to my medication at the time. I was in a really bad place, and they said, we want to give you full pay, just go and get better. That's all we want you to do is just go get better. We won't stop your pay. We know we got a lot of appointments. And at the time, to be honest, when you're in it again, it was an extremely useful thing that they did for me. Don't get me wrong, so just bear that in mind. I'm not saying it wasn't good what they did. But as I reflect and I shared that story with others, everyone's like, oh, that was so useful for you. But there's a lot of things that my workplace did that didn't help, and that actually eroded trust a whole lot more than that compensation. So you know, lots of different examples. When I went back to work, they didn't ask what I needed in terms of what I needed to return to work. They assumed what I needed, and they actually ended up giving me some really menial tasks because I had such bad anxiety. They thought, we'll just give her some really low-end jobs. That'll help her in her mental health journey. Where actually, being a smart person myself, I like to think, I wanted to be engaged, I wanted to be intellectually challenged. And I just found an interesting point around the compensation's useful, but actually, when you're going for a recovery journey, it is so much more than compensation. It is actually feeling safe. It's feeling like you're being taken care of. It's wanting to get better. It isn't about the money. It isn't about necessarily all that stuff. It's actually just because people who have disability or injury just want to feel like themselves again.
And there's a lot of, I think, a lot of good examples there. But what else can insurers, regulators, or lawyers do to build trust?
I think part of the problem is the system is set up adversarially, and so I think there's a change there. And like I sit back and observe that, you know, when legal costs start in a matter, so the insurers want to be able to, I think, have gone off down a different claims management model, which I think is far preferable. We want to deal direct with the injured person. We don't want lawyers in the middle of it because we want to deal direct with it. You speak to a group of lawyers, they want to be in there right at the start, advocating for, you know, everything left, right and centre. So I think the way that's set up makes it very hard. But I don't think that's a reason to say no. I actually think the insurance industry in particular has got to go down the path it's on now in terms of, you know, a much more empathetic approach to dealing with people. And the lawyers will always be there, you know, they'll always be there. But I think that's a better approach because we don't see all of the cases. You know, we get the hard ones here. So it's that lot, you must be doing something right.
Belinda?
Yeah, so from our perspective, I'll give you another client story because I love the client stories because they make my heart sing. I just love people seeing people on their recovery journeys. So this particular client, Mike, he rang us and he was in quite a distressed state because his surgery had been delayed a number of times that he needed. And like most of the country, Tasmania, we're not immune to challenges in our health system. But the thing that was really important here was that the claims officer who took that call, she didn't just focus on his surgery, she focused on his entire life situation and what he was going through. So the surgery, yes, was one issue which we could certainly look at and see what we could do in terms of that, but it was more of that holistic review of what other services we could fund to help Mike in his recovery journey. So she did a holistic review of the claim and uplifted it to our claims manager, and we were able to put in other supports for Mike while he was waiting for his surgery. So I think it really is about that, you know, looking at the person as the individual. What Camille's just touched on, what might work for one person doesn't necessarily work for the next, right? So it is about considering entirely what's going on in their lives.
You don't know that unless you ask.
Yeah, exactly.
I think we can so easily, and you know, we're all guilty of it. We just make assumptions. We go, okay, well, I've had someone who's similar to you, so I'm going to make an assumption that your outcomes or your needs are very similar as well. And you can, of course, in your mind have, that's natural, you're going to have those thoughts. But actually sense checking that with the person, asking them, even asking them what their expectations are, I think sometimes are useful because it actually allows you to communicate any discrepancies between what that actually may happen and what their expectations. But if we don't stop to ask, we can't resolve those discrepancies between us.
Just reminded me of this amazing Brene Brown clip on the difference between empathy and sympathy.
Oh, yeah, I love that video.
Genuine empathy is really when you are actually understanding the world through that person's lens,
Yeah.
not your perception potentially of that lens. It's a great little YouTube clip. If you just search Brene Brown empathy, it's a cute cartoon as well. But that just came to mind as you were describing that as a really good example of where, with the best of intentions, we still get it so wrong because we're seeing the world through our lens maybe rather than someone else's. We've got a question come through from the audience, and coincidentally, it's actually clearly about Sarah, so I won't ask any of you to answer this, although feel free to. The panel discussion is largely focused on trust between participant and insurer. Through a workers' compensation lens, so much relies on the trust of the employer. As a regulator, what steps is Sarah taking to lift and restore trust between the participant and the employer? I can't help but think one of my staff must be in the room, so it's a very clever question. But it leans towards, I suspect, Kath, the work we're doing around workplace facilitated discussions, as an example, because that employer relationship is the primary relationship a person has as their connection to the workforce. And we see time and time again where somebody becomes detached from their employer, their journey goes well and truly sideways. But it's a complicated part of the story, particularly where it relates to psychosocial injury in the workplace. How do you actually get the employee and the boss, who may at one point have been considered the source of the problem, to have those conversations? So we've been working with providers to actually build a model around how we actually sit down ultimately with the employer and the employee with the appropriate supports and actually have those discussions to get people back into the workplace and bridge that trust gap that might have started to exist in the early parts of that experience within the workplace, so that those first few weeks of a claim are more likely to be successful. So I think there are lots of interventions we can do at varying points in time, and I think to the point you make, both Belinda and Judge, by the time you see it, trust is well and truly eroded. But there are so many opportunities along the way that even if it goes off the rail, that an intervention, particularly as early as possible, can make a difference. So now the next question I'm going to wait, because we are going to get to a section, a sort of a line of chat that I think will work really well for this. So we'll come back to the next one. How do we deal with misaligned incentives in the shift in trust? Is there a challenge there, and what does that look like, and how do we solve it?
Well, when you look at some of the legislation, and I'll talk about New South Wales, but I think it's pretty similar around the place. Gateways to benefits are at 15% whole person impairment or 20% or whatever the number is. So immediately you've loaded into the system an incentive for someone to actually be worse, not to get better, because I've got to get to the 15% or 20%. I was saying when we were just outside, I had a poor chap in front of me a month ago and was describing how much pain he was in. Now, it's statutory compensation, you get nothing for that. And I gently explained that, well, I'm sorry, sir, you don't get compensated for pain. Here it's a whole person impairment. The look of shock on his face, because the number he had was pretty minor. But I think those incentives drive behaviours which aren't the best, and they're sort of hardwired into some of these schemes. And I don't know what you do about that, because premiums have been set on that basis. The whole edifice has been set up on that basis. But I think that's a really unhelpful thing if you're trying to get someone back on their feet. You want them concentrating on getting better, not maximising their WPI.
Absolutely. What can be done to change the role legal representatives play in building insurer trust for the benefit of an injured person's recovery?
There was a minister in New South Wales 20 years ago who described trying to change workers' comp or third-party schemes as like watching the first 20 minutes of Saving Private Ryan. It is such a contested area. And the problem is that minister lost a lot of paint by trying to do precisely that with the legal profession. So I'm a great believer in trying to work with what we've got, because if you do try and, change legislation, and God forbid touch benefits, you're inviting, a massive conflict. So I think making what we have work better within those parameters, I think, is something you can go out and do today. You don't need someone else to come along with an answer, because if there was an answer, it would have been thought of. But I think the conflict which has been set up is just far too unhealthy in my view.
Belinda, any thoughts on working with legal representatives and how they might be able to contribute?
Yeah, for sure. So from a legal representative perspective, so we have an in-house solicitor panel. So we have solicitors on our panel that act for us both from the plaintiff and also from the defendant. So having, again, strong relationships with the solicitor panels is very helpful. But I also think, again, going back to a client perspective, building a relationship with them from the get-go so that they understand what their entitlements are, I think is also critical. So I think the legal aspect is one side of it, but I also think there's that relationship with the funding body to know, we're a social insurer, so we absolutely try to work with the clients so that they have the best recovery or journey to independence that they can. But also if they're entitled to damages, we also try to make that process as smooth as we can too, because, for most people, a legal process is quite an anxious, it's quite an anxiety-invoking, process. So you don't want them, you want the client to be focused on getting to the best place that they can be. And so, for example, an initiative that we implemented a few years ago is one we call First Contact. So within 2 business days, most times we're able to contact the person on the day that we receive a claim. We try to call the client if it's appropriate. Obviously, there's some circumstances where it might not be, or we might contact a family member. But from the get-go, we let them know that we exist, that even if you're at fault, you're indemnified. So we try to alleviate some of that anxiety and, what the person's going through after the traumatic instance right up front. So I think it's both working with the client so that they understand what they're entitled to, depending on the situations of their particular accident, but also having strong relationships with our solicitor panels so they know that we have got the best interests of the client at heart. So if they're entitled to damages and need to go through a common law process, that we'll work with them on both fronts. So I think a lot of it is also about clear relationships and trying to make processes as easy as you can in difficult situations.
Now, if we think about sort of society more broadly, not just our little compensation world per se, this next question's a cracker. Judge, are the courts and tribunals the last bastion of trust and maintaining trust in our society?
Obviously, I'd like to think so, but I think it's not something that any member of the judiciary can be complacent about. Most people, if they're lucky, never go to court, or if they do, it's once in their life. Trust of the community in what we do will depend upon that interaction with a citizen the one time they come to court. And that's a whole bunch of things on the left here. So the ability, benevolence, integrity. People have actually there's a lot of trust that a litigant places in the decision maker, be it a judge or a member, and the way they behave, the way they listen. They might get irritated with counsel or whatever, the whole range of things which go on. But collectively, that's the view people will form about the institution. And as I say, institutions can be fragile. So, one of the legacy organisations from the commission I now head, I know it didn't have the trust of the insurance industry because it was it was a situation where, almost every kiddie won a prize. Right now, and I'm quite happy with where we are, hard decisions can be made. And I think that actually engenders trust from, really half the litigants, which is the insurance industry. But, it's just something every member, every judge dealing with these cases, a bad experience erodes that trust that we just must have to be able to conduct these institutions.
Now, I want to turn to technology for a minute. There's the question I was going to ask, and then there's one from the audience. So I'll play both of them back because I think it'll inform the discussion. I was going to ask you, what role can technology play in measuring, monitoring, and in turn influencing trust? So there's the positive role for technology, I suppose. And then a good question from the audience was, what role does social media play in creating a lack of trust with so many varied, silly, uninformed statements being made by people who hide their identity behind funny names, or a TikTok purporting to be accurate information. So let's just talk about technology for a bit. Camille, have you got any thoughts on the positive or negative side of technology in building trust?
It's almost like a devil with a halo on it. It's hard because social media has so many beautiful things about it. It keeps us connected. It gives us access to information. It can make people feel included where they didn't feel included before. I've had loads of people who have disabilities and injuries who find groups on Facebook that make them feel like they belong for the first time and seen as part of a community. So I think social media has such a powerful role in lots of different ways, but it also is it can have really negative impacts on people's mental health, on their livelihoods. There's the idea of the trolls that come up on social media who, like to, make some trouble. So if you think about that and then the scheme of things of more broadly in the schemes and processes, I think technology has a beautiful role to play in terms of scalability. It's scalable, it can be seamless. It also allows accessibility, and something I didn't, again, even though I'm not someone who identifies with a disability, I do have something I manage in a mental health condition I work with every single day, and I didn't realise that when I speak to other people who have different disabilities or different injuries, that technology actually enables them to be included for the first time. It enables them to have, I had some great work with people earlier in the year around all the different technologies I didn't know existed that were brilliant around access. So it does have a great role to play, but I think if we use it too much and we rely on it, and we have things like forms that don't let you complete it unless you get the mandatory question correct in their mind, it can plague us with that lack of trust. So I do think it has to be very mindful. So I think at the technology, I always talk about mindful technology. What is it intending to do? What's the experience for the individual? How is it actually playing a role for that individual? Is it adding to our trust? Is it taking away from trust? And what's the experience of the person?
Belinda?
And I think Camille, touching on that point about mindful technology, I think there is a role for technology in claims management, but more so, as I've already spoken about it, that sort of rapid claim end where people are in and out and they don't need a whole ton of support. Whereas, when you look at the Mikes and the Jareds, I think there is a huge risk if you go too far with technology that you're not going to capture the whole story, right? So you need to be looking outside of what the injury is and what's going on in that person's life. And certainly the conversations that we have, that our claims team have with our clients in those more sort of complex situations are invaluable in terms of helping those clients get back to the best place that they can be. So I do think it is definitely a balancing act in terms of claims management. In terms of technology advances in medical treatment, I can see huge advances on the horizon for our clients, and Camille, you touched on this as well. We have non-verbal clients that the only way they can communicate, or the best way they can communicate, is through technology, through devices. And so effectively they've been enabled with a voice that they may not have had without that technology solution. Same with assistive technology developments, and for everybody who was at PEEF and saw Jordan Nguyen and some of the advances in the medical technology there with AI and everything else, absolutely, I think that there are advances that could be amazingly beneficial for clients in the right situation. But it's keeping an eye on what developments are happening, and again, looking at the client and what's going on for them and what works for them as an individual.
I think that comes back to Camille's point, just quickly, that sort of the idea of these enabling technologies or assistive technologies, if we're talking about how we build trust within our sector, but if they're restoring that person's trust in the whole world, as you talked in your opening statement about trust has just been lost generally when somebody finds themselves that injured. So those things might actually make, if the world becomes more accessible, there might be a greater propensity to trust again, perhaps. So there is a huge role there, definitely.
Absolutely.
If you use technology, make sure it works.
Exactly.
Like having to tell your story about technology is fine, but then having to repeat it on the phone to Joe Blogg, to then repeat it to Nancy, but you've already written it in the system, like in the technology, that's when it doesn't work.
And then have to wait because I'm waiting for my system to reboot. So you're going to have to sit there and make small talk on the phone for a bit or something, definitely.
It's funny, technology used well, though, can enhance trust, in my view. And I'll use an example. So in, I think it was 2022, you'll remember the COVID mandates that governments brought in. If you wanted to work in the public service, you had to have your shots. Now, there was a case in the Supreme Court of New South Wales, which was one of the most watched things ever, when very smart judge sat there and listened to, these people, challenging the government's mandates. Now, it was actually quite an educative thing for the public. They watched that and could actually see that there was no basis in a scientific sense in terms of the challenge. But what they saw was a very reasoned, civilised discussion about it, which you don't get on social media or on, television talk programs or anything. And, the inevitable result happened, just accepted, just accepted. And so, there, I actually think it makes the courts and tribunals much more accessible for cases like that. So people can see what's being done on behalf of the community by the court and can see how it's, they can understand the result.
Now, turning back to how we sort of build some trust again within the schemes themselves, this is a nice question given we discovered at the start, according to Edelman, healthcare is one of the more trusted areas of our world in Australia. How can we leverage the trust our clients have in those other sectors, like health providers, to build trust within our workers' comp and CTP schemes? So
I think it's about helping the clients establish a trusting relationship with the providers. So it's like the triangle, right? It's funder, provider, client. And I think that definitely, getting the right services in place for the client at the right time, so knowing when the client might need a different type of intervention, for example. So I think it's about, again, looking at that client's particular journey and making sure that they have access to the right services to assist them at the right times. So it's knowing your clients, it's listening to them, and same thing with your providers. You will have providers that are, have preference or more expertise in certain areas depending on the client need. We have some excellent case managers in Tasmania that will get involved in the client journey at the right point in time. So it's that ability to recognise what the person needs to facilitate their recovery journey, and then having those trusted providers work with the clients and build the relationship with the clients.
I think that's the thing. I think it's relationships. I work in healthcare part of my week, and I think the noticeable difference I've seen, so I worked in corporate for most of my career, and I've just transitioned to public health department, and it actually is a very different environment. It's a very different culture. Corporate world tends to be more individualised. It's kind of head down into your work. You do have obviously the idea of collaboration stuff, but I think people who go into healthcare world do have this what they call benevolent nature. They want to help people. They're in a helping and caring role. That's the purpose of their role. So they usually have personalities that tend to lend towards that, which is why I think we have such a high trust in them, because they come with a caring, empathetic manner. While we have outside of that, we don't have individuals who are as inclined. We're all different. We all have different personalities, and that's completely okay. But I think that's why we have this trust in healthcare, because our general experiences with it are positive, because they are people who chose to go into careers that really do help people, while maybe otherwise, although everyone wants to help each other, I think there's maybe just different personality, I don't know, I'm just ad-libbing a little here about why the differences are and what we can do to think about the difference and how we translate that difference across.
We'll take a bit of a different track for a minute. A question from the audience is, the judge mentioned that our systems are inherently adversarial. Does he think alternative forms of dispute resolution can help with this?
Oh yeah, I think when I look at the two schemes that we administer, so workers' comp and motor accidents, I think motor accidents has got less ADR in it, and so it becomes far more adversarial. So, any judge will tell you they don't want to see a case until somebody has had a red hot go at trying to resolve it by, ADR or mediation, something like that. So, I actually think it has to be hardwired into these systems, because you're trying, at an early stage, you're trying to bring people together, and that's what I think you should be doing. There's always going to be disputes, hard cases, which get to us at the end, but the vast bulk don't need it. What most people need is a table, a venue to sit down and try and resolve what the issues in the case are, and the sooner you can action that, the better.
Now on that, the next question is, there's an incentive for lawyers to extend the duration of a case. Why shouldn't legal fees be transparent?
Well, most things in the world are transparent, and that should be no difference. You know, because if you're doing the right thing, you shouldn't have any problem, you know, with there being visibility of that. So, and I mean, like, most of these schemes have a near-death experience once every 10 or 15 years, and it's never just one thing which pushes it to the brink. It's a whole range of things. And so it gives regulators, insurers more data to be able to make informed decisions and have proper discussions with the profession about, you know, what sort of behaviour or what sort of charging mechanisms, you know, aren't appropriate. I mean, but I start from the point of view, whether it's, you know, the insurance industry or the plaintiff bar or the defendant bar, most people come to work each day to do the right thing. You know, and so I just think one does need to be a bit careful that there is always going to be outliers, but that's not the vast bulk of people we're dealing with.
Yeah, back to that point of we're seeing the worst end of things.
Yep.
There's still all of the ones that don't get to us that are indicative that maybe things aren't working so badly after all.
I think inherently as people, we like to focus on the negative. Like anyone who knows any neuroscience here, like our brains instantly attach on to negative things. I think our brains activate neurotransmitters about 9 times more minimum when you have a negative stimuli versus a positive stimuli. So we're going to grab onto that a lot faster than we hear. So we have to hear 10 positive stories essentially to then outride that one negative story. And I think that's where a lot of this goes wrong. And maybe it comes back to the marketing that Judge mentioned earlier. We're not actually telling as many stories, the positive cases that come through these systems. Perhaps there's an opportunity to kind of lift those voices up to go, actually, I did get the help I need, I did get the support I need, and this is what worked really well. And then in itself, that starts role modelling what we're doing really, really well, and then we don't focus as much on the 5% that aren't going as well.
We've got a question that will turn us back to technology briefly, in a way. So the question is, so often trust is founded on relationships. Relationships are more easily built through conversation. So what tips have we got for building relationships and trust with newer generations who don't seem to use telephones for the purpose Alexander Graham Bell intended? That's an excellent question. You've got to occasionally remind yourself, they make phone calls too. How crazy. Any thoughts on how we deal with the younger generation, particularly, you know, the ones that you'll call, they'll hang up and send you a text message saying, what do you want?
Look,
So true.
I've got kids, as have you. I mean, you know, I'd love to know the answer to that.
Yeah.
I feel like
There's the book to write.
so much because my first job, I'm not Gen Z, but I'm young. Like I've come from the world of technology, and when I first had my first ever HR job, I was living in London as a HR assistant, and I had a fear of the telephone. So this thing would ring and I would just wait for someone else, because obviously anyone could kind of pick it up on behalf of someone else, and I'd wait till someone picked it up. And my boss caught on to this. So she caught on to the fact that I would not pick up that phone, and one day, I don't know if this is the right thing for a manager to do, but she just sit at my desk saying, pick it up, pick it up, pick it up, pick it up. Because I was so scared of that phone. I don't know what it was. I actually cannot verbally, tangibly tell you why it was so terrifying. And to this day, and I talk a lot about it with my friends and my colleagues, for some reason, it feels more, you have to actually say something straight away. You don't get a processing time. With technology or social media or text messages, you have time to process information. And I think that's actually the biggest, I don't know if that doesn't really help the answer at all, but hopefully gives some insight of why maybe, I think I reflect about why it's so hard to answer a telephone or something like that, because it is a lot harder to answer in the moment when you do have, it's just harder to answer in the moment. So maybe that's why the telephone feels quite terrifying for people at that age.
It's a really good point. The question makes me think about some work I did in a completely unrelated sector as a volunteer. And it was really about meeting young people where they are and where they're comfortable. It was an online mentoring platform that relied on text-based chat. And at first, I was disappointed. I'm like, that's surely not cool enough. Surely these days we can do something heaps cooler than a text-based chat. But all the research we did validated that somebody who's 13, 15, and in our cases we'd be talking about people up to maybe 25 or so, their default mechanism is to text. That's the safe sort of method of communicating. So it really probably is about saying, how do we use technology now to deliver the sort of omni-channel experience and be okay that they might like the processing time, they might like the confrontation of having to speak to someone they don't know. So how do we use those new technologies to sort of reach people in their own way? And that piece of work we did around text-based chat was enormously successful at having really difficult conversations with highly vulnerable people, because they didn't have to feel that I can see you judging me, or whatever it might have been that was going through their mind. So I think the answer is use the phone for whatever they need to use it for, even if it isn't what it was intended. And we've got all this ability now to build far greater options for communicating and connecting with people that, and particularly there was a comment earlier about people who might be non-verbal and not have the opportunity to use the phone. It does feel a bit archaic some days, doesn't it, that we still operate with predominantly call centres.
So it's funny, I actually would say I feel closer to someone texting them than I do on the phone, because I think you have to keep your words less, and I wouldn't text someone formally. So text is an informal mechanism in some way. So I find text a lot more personal than a phone call. Interesting, just to add another layer of perspective there.
Yeah, interesting. And just by the by, as I was walking in this morning, I tried to call somebody because the slides hadn't arrived at the right destination. My call was rejected and I got a text message saying, "Is everything okay? What do you need?" Like, I needed you to answer the phone. So I think we've just got to live with that one, and that is that bit of evolution for all of us. So some good tips there, but I think if you do nail it, I think there's a parenting book waiting to be written by the sound of it, doesn't there? So,
yeah.
So much data is collected in reporting claims, like Camille's example, but it's often not used at all. How can data and information systems be better designed to make sure the right parties and service providers have the right data to make the right decisions for the claimant? E.g., a healthcare specialist knowing more of the history and environment of an individual rather than just the injury. Any thoughts? We do, as a sector, we collect extraordinary amounts of data. How do we use it better?
I have thought of this more from the consumer perspective, but I'm just curious, and Judge or Belinda, if you have more from the...
I'm really concerned with the volume of stuff which we get given. Probably if there's one thing that concerns me as the head of the tribunal is being hacked. Because we've got all this dreadfully private health information about a whole bunch of people. So in some respects, I want that stuff that we need and no more. So there's a lot of data through it, but I think we've got to temper the collection of data to really focus on what do we really need. Because it's really easy with the systems we all have now to measure and record everything, but I just think we've got to review that, because the stuff which we hold, we should not be given by both parties.
And I think with data, the thing is that some data is easy to distill, right? Like injury codes. You can instantly, generate a report on what injuries the person sustained. But what a lot of the data systems do not capture is the person's life situation. And I think as we're getting more mature as schemes managing somebody's recovery journey, we're seeing it's not the injuries, it's actually also what else is going on. So what family supports do we have in place? Does that particular person have in place compared to somebody who doesn't have as much family support? What pre-existing conditions did the person have prior to the accident compared to somebody that didn't have the same pre-existing conditions? So I think it is a really careful balance with the data to make sure that you're getting the right data and interpreting the data correctly, because there are some things that won't necessarily get captured in your reporting, and it could be a big omission. What happens if somebody doesn't have the right home to return to for their rehabilitation journey, So I think it's about how you capture it, how you then analyse it, and then making sure that you're getting the whole picture for that person, particularly in your more complex claims where you've got a lot going on, not just injury, but outside of their life, what life impacts are also going on for that particular person.
It certainly is, just reading the nature of that question, it's the perennial challenge for us, right? How do we, when you've got a GP or a healthcare provider who really understands somebody more holistically, and a case manager then has some lines on the screen, but have to make those decisions, how do we do that in a way that doesn't expose too much information, doesn't put us in a bad position, but also you're not having to tell your story twice. There's all of those sorts of things for us to solve with that. And again, that's probably the other one, that when somebody does solve that, they probably should be sitting up here talking to us about it, because it is the big challenge. And we could be at least using it for sentiment analysis, or the unstructured data these days, I suppose, the developments in AI, while both terrifying ethically at some levels, but also unbelievably beneficial at others, maybe we'll start to see some of that unstructured data being turned into insight for us, and we can only hope that makes the case manager experience more positive. Following on from Dylan's address around lived experience, is the answer around building more trust is to have more people with lived experience of disability and injuries working in the sector? A feel like I know what you might say here.
Great question. 110% yes is the answer. I am, as you can tell, I do a lot of lived experience advocacy work. I'm involved in a lot around even not so much just even myself, my own experiences, but also I facilitate a lot of processes where I engage with lived experience people from both mental health conditions but also physical health conditions, and then sharing those stories back in a thematic analysis kind of way. But at the end of the day, the reality is that it is very hard to understand what someone's gone through without being it through yourself. There's a thing in science called perspective gap, if anyone wants to look it up. It's actually really interesting scientific phenomenon where even if, so imagine when we have a headache, we kind of always think, oh, I have this headache. can't remember what it's like not having the headache. But then when we don't have the headache, we forget what it's like to have a headache. And so even if we've been through, it's interesting, even though we've been through an experience before, it is still actually really hard to connect with someone's experience. But it's able to go and reflect back at where you've been. So I always say, I do think it's really useful to have lived experience people either working in the roles or advising into the roles or providing around the processes of the roles, which is what CIRA does. CIRA has a lived experience reference group, which actually provides a lived experience group to provide advice and guidance when they are doing some changes or similar. But if you don't have that, if you don't have people lived experience in the roles, having someone guiding the processes around that, so people who are operating the roles, even if they don't have lived experience, they know what questions to ask, they know what language to use, they are providing a safe, like I said before, trauma-informed care. It's actually just getting lived experience to be in the forefront of how we design our systems. That is the key, not always necessarily having lived experience people in the roles. If that's great, but I think it's actually having them inform the system.
Yeah, absolutely agree with everything Camille just said. I think having people in the teams with lived experience, it's invaluable because they have that, we can all step back and try and be in somebody else's shoes, but if you've lived through it, so I think there's absolutely room there and something we should all be looking into.
It's almost like having a peer network for people in the schemes, whether you can have a person who's had a good experience and a positive experience. Not saying, and this is what happens, and not saying that person just tells them, oh, you should do this to get past the system, but having maybe someone to just give a bit of just support and understanding of what the system's like. I'm just, again, thinking of ideas here for a little bit, but just a thought process of how to actually better enable the trust.
So much of building trust is actually about people, obviously, and we've talked about that a lot this morning. How can we engage the right people and educate people in the industry to build trust? How do we make this a mission we all take on?
I think for us, it's having people that have that natural empathy and genuine desire and care to help people get better. So, you do have those people that, we're talking about trust in healthcare professionals. Their whole mandate from when they go to university is, I want to help people get better. So having people with that mindset, assisting effectively our clients, that's what the aim is, right? We will get back to health, get back to work, get back to your best place you can be. So I think having people with that same mindset is absolutely critical there in terms of that focus and that passion. Our people genuinely, you can see it in their eyes, we want to see our clients get well. So I think that's really important.
The reality is there is a commercial lens to all of this as well. Like, things cost money, and it is a system, right? Like, we have to bear in our mind it isn't all sunshine and rainbows. We can't just throw money at people and flowers. And not saying that you're saying that, but I reflect on this a lot about how do we balance the human approach with the costs of the system. And I used to work very long time ago now. It was only a very short stint at an insurance company, and I remember hearing from the recovery team there about all their goals was to how to get individuals either recovered faster or prevention of actually getting an illness or injury at work. And at first, I thought it was just that one team, but actually the entire organisation's vision and motto, how do we prevent injuries and illnesses at work, and how do we, if they do happen to get injured or unwell, how do we support them to get back faster? And yes, it had a commercial benefit. There was a commercial benefit to the insurance company for that to happen, but that was not their vision. Their vision was to support the individual, and that achieved the commercial goals, but it actually allowed people to have a values-based approach, actually follow a vision, and put the person at the centre of the schemes.
I think it's a really, really good example, because the next question was how do we put care first rather than liability, and I think we've started to lean to that. I often think about the role we have as a regulator as experiencing this tri-tensions of benefits, affordability and sustainability, and pulling one lever almost inevitably will pull the other one the other direction, so it is a balancing act. But it comes down to two things. I think you mentioned value-based care, which is something we're really serious about at CIRA. The right care makes a huge difference for the right price. So when we're spending the money, we want to get the right results. So you can actually balance the cost of a liability with giving good care if you've got the right models of care. And I think that's a really critical piece of work for us all to keep tackling, so that those benefits versus affordability arguments get solved, because there is a large amount of low-value care in our schemes. It's hard to avoid sometimes, so that's one way to do it. But it's about culture. It's about that purpose, and saying when you get out of bed in the morning, and our people laugh at me now because I almost go out of my way to try and find a way to say at every town hall or every staff meeting, I'll make sure we talk about how our purpose is to make sure that New South Wales insurance schemes protect and support the people who need them now and into the future. It's on posters around the building, but it's about saying that is our core mission. We have to make this sustainable and affordable, absolutely. But that happens when people get good quality care and they get back to work sooner, or they get back on the road sooner. So I think building that culture that it is about being we're a human-focused organisation fundamentally. Even as a regulator, we are a human-focused organisation, and that drives that conversation. Now, there is still, Camille, you're right, there's the commercial imperative, absolutely, but I think we've just got to keep talking about it's the Richard Branson model of treat your people better first, they'll treat your customer first.
Yeah.
Deal with the human, the liability conversation might follow. So, someone has now said the solution to an overly adversarial system is using data to clearly demonstrate that different pathway produces significantly better outcomes for the injured person. So the question was, is the solution using data to try and define those pathways and work out what different pathways might exist?
Oh, look, I agree, because you sit in some of these meetings, which we all do, everyone's got millions of opinions on it. Having the facts is really good. Like, you don't generally have an ugly discussion with someone when you've got a set of numbers in front of you. But when you move off that page and it becomes opinions about stuff and anecdotes about dreadful cases, well, they're going to resolve nothing.
And I think we're starting to do some work now around reducing friction and looking at where those friction points are. And the next step really is then to say, well, let's unpack them. If 95% of these issues go this direction, why are we doing that? Why are we allowing that? We know that there are a number of disputes that make their way to you that probably just shouldn't, and we need to sort of use the data to understand where's the best point in time we can identify that friction point and stop it. Redirect it the right path that gets a better outcome early. So I think to the person who raised that, the answer is absolutely yes. That is definitely part of the solution.
I just think being mindful of the data points we are using. I did some work earlier in the year around supporting injured workers get workplace adjustments at the workplace. And if you looked at the numbers, there wasn't really much of a story to tell. There was X number of workplace adjustments requested, this many declined, this many accepted, and there wasn't really much to it. And so they asked me, as a lived experience person, can you engage with our workers? Are we completely anonymous, completely confidential about how injured workers or people who have disability engage with the workplace adjustment process? And you'd be surprised by at least half the people who came to me in these interviews and focus groups hadn't actually requested a workplace adjustment. Many of them hadn't even told the employer that they had a visual impairment, because they were able to come to the interview via Zoom and didn't need to inform the employer until they're actually at the workplace and got the offer. And as much as all these individuals, it was actually one of the most eye-opening processes and engagements I've ever done. But I just always think of that as an example. When we looked at the data, there was nothing really saying much. But when we started having conversations, the information, the detail, just the complete and utter, just the detailed information of the stories of individuals who weren't feeling comfortable to speak up. Those who were requesting adjustments weren't getting the right adjustments. Those who were getting the right adjustments took 6 months of their employment to get the right adjustment to actually engage into their jobs. It was actually astonishing what came out of that process. It just makes me think it's great to have a data point, and they are extremely valuable. but let's just always be mindful of the data points we're looking at. Where have they come from? What are they telling us? Is there more we can understand from this data point? What else can we ask? And just challenging ourselves a little bit on the data.
I'm sure there's a neuroscience answer to that, but when you're looking at data, it's a validity paradox, I suppose, isn't it? That you suddenly think you're looking at everything and the right thing, and something's glaringly missing in that picture. Turning back to healthcare briefly, how do you keep client trust when you deny a treatment because it's low-value care?
Can you repeat that question?
So how do you keep client trust when you deny a treatment because it's low value? So a claims manager's made an appropriate decision that this isn't the right thing, but now someone's not getting what they want. How do you maintain trust there?
Communication is key. So it's outlining to the client why the decision was made, and going beyond that, then looking at what would potentially be better for the client. So having the conversation, not just, we've denied that. It's about, we don't think that that service is, the most appropriate for whatever reason, and looking at them holistically and what's going on, and then looking at what might be, a service that we could fund. So it's about relationship, it's communication, 100%, because people want to understand, because in there, I'd say in 95% of these cases, people think they just go, I'm going to get that service, and that's a service that I need. So it's about bringing them to a point of understanding as to why that might not be the most appropriate at that point in time, and then what else can be offered, and just continuing the conversation with the person so that they understand why the decision's been made.
I mean, if that's well, we're on the frontline piece for a moment, are there other sort of hot tips at the front end around how we can be building trust and what we can be doing?
So for us, building trust really starts with early intervention. So I've talked about first contact and how we make sure that the client knows we exist and what we can and can't fund, so they know what their entitlements are within the scheme. And then, continuing that relationship with the client, and not everybody's very individual and very different. So you've got to look at the individual circumstance. And I'll give you a great example of a client's story. So we had a gentleman called Hanson, and Hanson was out in Tassie on a working visa. So he was out here and he decided to take a trip up the east coast of Tassie. And if you have a chance, here's my Tassie promo, if you have a chance, get up to the east coast. It's an amazing part of the world. Have a look around. So anyway, Hanson decided to go up the east coast on his motorbike this particular weekend with some mates, and he hit a deer. And so he fractured his ankle and his wrist. And, being from an international country, he was worried about how he was going to pay, like what happens now, So all of that goes through his mind. He's quite seriously injured, and how's he going to pay for this? To the point where his mates were going to looked at strapping him to the motorbike to get him back to hospital type thing. So thankfully for Hanson, on his journey, some paediatric nurses from the Royal Hobart happened to come across the accident scene and went, whoa, 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 whoa. MAIB exists. This is what, you're insured, you're covered. And he was airlifted to the Royal Hobart and underwent surgery and started his recovery journey. So as part of that journey, we uncovered through communication and relationship building that Hanson's place of residence was actually 2 stories and had a spiral staircase. So certainly not something very helpful for somebody who now has mobility issues. So again, we were able to step in and provide supported independent living accommodation that MAIB owns in Tassie, so that we could help to facilitate Hanson's recovery journey. And the good news story is for Hanson, obviously he's been on quite the journey, but he's actually looking at returning he was a bus driver prior to the accident. So, it is about that early intervention. It's about understanding the client situation. So I would just really encourage people to know your clients, particularly those more complex ones where that early intervention and getting him the right, not only acute treatment, but into the right rehabilitation setting, it just makes a world of difference. So that would be my red hot tip for those, complex clients.
That, like having the micro communication skills, so just simple things like using people's names in a conversation. Like, oh, hi Adam, like repeating the name, for example, can make someone feel grounded. you're paraphrasing back to someone, clarifying with someone, summarising back to them. There's some really basic tools in like the micro skills of communication that training your people on those skills, like I said, having trauma-informed practice training, there's quite a few ways I think you can, there's big picture things you can do, but there's also some really micro things you can do to actually focus on skills for your individuals, your employees, and who are supporting the individual worker, of the injured worker.
Terrific. Now, we've only got a handful of minutes left. I'm going to give you the warning now. I'm going to ask you to finish with 3 words to describe how we can better build trust. I was going to land it on you, but I thought I might give you the warning now. The final question we've got here from the audience today is a regulator one. So I'll read it and I'll answer it briefly, but offer myself during the break so that we can get back to most of the panel. What would it take for regulators to trust scheme stakeholders more, i.e. relax their intervention and direction on the day-to-day operations of schemes to focus on only the macro levers? There's 2 parts of that. One is the regulators continuing to mature to being better at being risk-based. A lot of that comes from the access to quality data they have from their regulated entities to make good risk and intelligence-led decision-making. So that's certainly a key part of it. And then earned autonomy really genuinely comes from doing the right thing and no longer needing to be on the regulator's radar. I think in one of our schemes, we have quite a raft of performance levels between entities. Some have worked really, really hard to remediate the issues that mattered to us, and they talk to us a whole lot less than they used to. Some are still on a bit of a journey, and we have a lot more time spent with them. So I think it's about trust, actually, fundamentally. Does the regulator trust you'll be doing the right thing along the way? And then as the regulator develops their risk-based approach to things, hopefully that earned autonomy will increase. But happy to chat to anyone during the break about a bit more on that. So one more question before I get to the 3 words. Camille, I want to go back to you just to sort of finish us off, if you will. As someone who's had the experience of recovering at work, would you share a little bit more about your experience and what, importantly, made you more or less trusting along the way?
Yes, good question. Conscious that we only have a few minutes left, so I will pick
Lock the doors. We've got all day.
I think one of the things I mentioned before, one of the biggest things around eroding the trust was just not understanding the person was at the centre of the care. I was at a point where I was quite suicidal in my journey. I hadn't got the care, I hadn't told anyone I was unwell until I kind of had to in the workplace. And I remember the first response they had was they got me to a meeting room, they threw a phone to me, and I kind of thought my manager would sit me down and talk to me and, you know, just hear what I was going through. And she threw a phone in my hand and she's like, oh, it's the EAP, there's someone on the phone. And so I put the phone to my ear and this person's like, hi, I'm X, I'm from the EAP, I'm here to talk to you. And what I thought my manager would stay with me at the time, she walks out, and the most hardest thing of that situation is that she didn't realise is I was in a glass room. So the workplace was full of glass meeting rooms, and so I had people, this is a very busy workplace, financial services, big company, had kept walking past me, watching me cry and tell someone, a stranger on the phone, that I didn't want to be here anymore. And that, I know, is a big scenario, but I think it's where a really example where we forget the person at the centre of the situation. We use fear to define our actions, and in that situation, for example, it was fear, it was unknown, what do we do, how do we help her? We'll just throw her to someone else. We'll just put her in this room and get her a phone call. And in contrast to that, you know, a few months, well, actually not a few months, a year later when I was on my recovery journey, I'd left that workplace, went to a different workplace, and I had called my employer that day because I was having some suicidal thoughts that if anyone experiences that, they're involuntary and they just kind of happen sometimes when you're going through a severe mental health condition. And so I called up my workplace that day and I hadn't told them again, this was a different place. And I said to them, I'm having some really difficult thoughts this morning. I still want to come to the workplace. I want to come to work because for me, that's what's going to help me recover. I don't want to go home because I just get stuck with my thoughts. And they were like, yep, no worries, I'm not there today, but I'll get someone else to come support you. I went to the office and the whole way, the 45-minute walk to work, I was like, don't cry, you're fine, you're fine, you're fine. And I got to the office and the doors open, and what do you think happened? The lady was standing there and she's like, oh, are you okay? And I said, no, I'm not okay. The tears just come falling down after 45 minutes of willing myself not to cry. And in that moment, I was like, oh gosh, here comes the phone call, the EAP, here comes the glass box, it's gonna happen again, it's another big company, oh my gosh. And she just stood there and she said, you know, I've got your little pot over here in a little closed off space. She had a glass of water, a cup of tea. And she said, Camille, I don't know exactly what you're going through. I haven't had depression or anxiety before, but I want to help. What support can I give you right now? And she didn't wave a magic wand. She didn't do anything. She didn't listen to her first aid or like follow a checklist. She was just there for me in that moment and asked me what I needed in that very single moment. And I think that just to me sums up when we talk about injured workers, disability, people who are going through tough times, whether it's just even just you're going through a messy part of life. There's a person at the centre of that, and that person is struggling, and it's really just making sure that we just care for them in that very single moment. So
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing.
that's okay.
Judge, 3 words.
Oh, mate, no lawyers have ever got 3 words. I think, like, for my organisation, I want every touch, every time someone contacts us, it to be a quality event. And that will build trust across all of the cases that we do. So I want every time they contact one of our registry staff or before one of our members or dealing that it's a proper, proper contact.
Belinda?
Relationship, understanding, communication.
Brilliant. And Camille?
Type A personality over here. 3 words on the dot. I'm all like, I'm judge over here. I've got more than 3 words. Engage with lived experience voice and do it authentically and do it meaningfully is really my
Terrific.
top tip.
Would you join me in thanking our panel this morning? Thanks very much, folks.
Thank you.